Welcome, everybody. This is so exciting to see you all show up for the first in our series of the Eleanor William Hooker Tea Talk series. It's amazing. It shows that you've heard about what we're doing, and it shows that you're interested and willing to participate in dialogue. And this is what this is all about. It's not us talking to you, it's you talking with us, with our presenters and in community, so that we can dialogue and hopefully move our needles a little further, especially in this time that we're in, where it seems like the advances that we've made over the decades have disappeared. So welcome. Please feel free to share your thoughts, your words, and participate in this dialogue that we have today. We're very excited to be here, to be with at the library in this public space. I want to first thank our volunteers. If they could just stand, because you know putting this together takes a lot of work. Just show your hands for the Portsmouth Black Heritage Trail. I want to thank our sponsors, the library, Seacoast African American Cultural Center, and Paul Dowdy's production company for helping us to put this on. And I want to just introduce our speakers, but before I do, I just want to read a little story that I got when we went to Warner the other day, which I thought was really appropriate for the work that we're doing and the space, that dialogue that we're trying to open up here. And I'll try to make it quick. There was a boy whose eyes were so true and hands so steady that he became a good marksman. He threw a stone or fired at anything with his ear gun. He usually hit right on. Near his house lived a bird, and now there were 4 little ones in the nest. The mother bird was busy from morning till night getting worms, bugs, and seeds for the little birds to eat. One day when the mother bird had picked up a worm and was resting a moment, this boy, the good marksman, saw her. "What a fine shot," he said, and fired his gun. The bird felt a sharp, stinging pain in her side, and when she tried to fly, she found she could not. Her wing was broken. Fluttering along, at last she reached the foot of the tree which held her nest. Her broken wing hurt her very much, but she chirped as bravely as she could to the little birds in the nest, trying to comfort them. All day she laid there, but as the hours went by, her voice grew fainter and fainter until it was still. The little one called in vain as they cuddled together in the cold, and at last their little chirps ceased. But for the rustle of the leaves as the wind blew through the trees, that was all that was left. Would the boy have been as proud of his good shot if he had known the whole story? So that's what we're trying to do here, is tell the whole story, a complete story, an American story that's more inclusive and fuller and richer. So today, I'm sorry, before we start, if there's anybody who is uncomfortable with being videotaped or pictured, could you just let us know and sit to this side of the room? You can let the camera people know. Except our speakers.
Suck it up, Siobhan.
I think you may have to sit like this. So I'm not going to read the bios because they're in your handout. But our speakers today are Paul Pilot, Siobhan Sr., and Liz Charlotte. So without much ado, I'm going to pass it all over to our panel.
Ooh.
Kawhi, hello. I'm really shocked. There's quite a few of you today. I didn't know what to expect today. It's an interesting thing to be indigenous today. There's a lot of confusion of what that really means. We, I'm 70 years old. I'm a baby boomer, and we came from a different time period when what was politically correct back after the war was quite a bit different than what it is today. And, you know, you see a lot of change in society as you grow older. And as I get older and older, I find that I still have that baggage from the past as well. I remember very distinctly I should really probably introduce myself better. My name is Paul Pulio. I'm the Sagamore and principal speaker of the Cossack Band of Pennacook and Abenaki people. I'm a 15th generation descendant of the original people that with the French, at least 15 generations back. My grandparents, my paternal grandparents, were the indigenous side, and they were both indigenous people. And I remember my grandmother, we were at the time living in the Worcester County area of Massachusetts. We had a house in Shrewsbury, but our grandparents were also on the other side, almost next to Worcester. At the time, I didn't realize we were living in a Nipmuc community, essentially, around the Quinsigamon Lake area. And I always thought it was interesting, as a kid in the 50s, we were somewhat aware of racial tension, but my grandmother was holding counsel on a regular basis in the kitchen with other women of color, because the women, I think, understood the interconnections of people. And the Nipmuc at that time had a diverse background as well, of having many of their tribal members were descendants of freed slaves in the Nipmuc community. So they were a combined community of different shades of Nipmuc as well as the Abenaki. So seeing my grandmother holding counsel with people of color was intriguing, but I never really understood the paradigm that I was looking at, what was going on in the early 50s. That being said, you know, you grow older and you go for all the cultural changes, and at some point in your life you end up being a community leader, and you have to reflect on all of this stuff. And I know today was supposed to be centered a little bit on the Durham post office issue because of the imagery and art and things that seem to be racially insensitive. This particular cartoon up here is interesting because this is one that was it was unleashed on us, unworthy of the Union leader. We didn't do anything wrong. The Department of Historical Resources identified that the site that was going to be developed was a major historical site in the Weirs area of Laconia, and it's where the old drive-in theater was. The woman is a developer, and she was trying to circumvent the fact that this property was on the National Historic Register, that archaeology had been done there, and it was a major Abenaki site, and there's potential burials there and other things of sacred interest to the indigenous community. Well, the Department of Historical Resources said, you know what, you have to be very cautious. This is a documented site, and we got a strong pushback, and the Union leader felt that it was comical to throw us in canoes, like we were protesting this poor woman's effort to redevelop this area, when in fact it's a sacred site and it has to be handled in a particular way. And this is a cartoon they came up with against us, and in fact we never really entered into the debate at all about this, other than the state said, be prepared, these people are going to try to fight you and your rights to protect the ancestral remains, if there are any, or any other artifacts. So that being said, art is very damaging sometimes, and in this case, this one was a below-the-belt hit for no reason, and I like to speak about that and other imagery. What else have we got?
Whatever you gave us.
Okay. When I first saw the brochure, I said, okay, here we go again. We're identified in two ways, or three ways. Reservation people, living in poverty, and if you go on the public channels, everything's sad and woeful, you know, life on the reservation. Or we're casino Indians, loads of money and, you know. Or we're powwow Indians, we always dress colorfully. And they're all stereotypes. I mean, I was discussing this issue when I first came in the room. I said, you know, looking for diversity pictures, I've often gone to the federal government to see what they had for diversity pictures. What do they consider indigenous person to look like? And boy, it's tough. It's so tough that the Cherokee actually put up a page of what the Cherokee look like, and they go from pure white to the darkest shade you can imagine, and they say we're all Cherokee. And I think that's a disarming way of dealing with racism, because when we look at, my wife and I consult with the federal government for the Department of Justice and the Bureau of Prisons, and they try to do the same thing with us in the federal prison system. It's like analogy would be all Asians are the same, all indigenous people are the same. It doesn't work, especially in that construct. We know there's 500 nations or more. There's probably as many belief systems, especially when it comes to religion, and cultural practices vary very, very much from individual to individual. So we can't all be lumped up into one picture that shows a powwow scene. And something like this is more appropriate in some cases when this is an indigenous photo. It just says indigenous people. We're of all shades and colors, and we have to recognize that. What's the next one? Do we have anything else that I can talk, and then I could pass it on, because I think this is a colorful. This is more of the diversity things that we see with the federal government now. The last time we met with directly with Department of Homeland Security, they were agonizing over how do we identify indigenous people. This is just before 45 took over. And they were all worried about what's going to mean to immigration, ICE, which was part of them. Well, we all know what happened, right? We were 1 year into that. And a lot of the discussion we forced onto the conversation, Homeland Security, is what is immigration? I mean, we, as indigenous people, what if there was a policy of immigration, you know? And oh, by the way, we have scores of cartoons about illegal immigration in the colonial era. So we could be humorous about this because it is a fascinating thing if we only knew better and thought more. When it comes to our people misunderstand who the Wabanaki are and Abenaki, and they try to pigeonhole us into little buckets, and that's because the Bureau of Ethnology in the 1800s was trying to document the people they were killing off. The Department of Ethnology really evolved out of the Department of War, the cavalry, the army, and they were killing us off faster than they were documenting us, so there was a little catch-up to figure out what the endangered species were. In the process, they identified 60 tribal names for us here in the Northeast, which were all, place name type of things. I'm going to give you a little history, and our history is best said not by the English. The English have really corrupted the whole history of the Northeast. We go back to the Jesuits, and we review the Jesuit notes. Just like when we talk about Columbus Day, we review Columbus's notes, his diaries. Columbus portrayed the indigenous people of the Caribbean as clean, healthy, pious, worthy of being slaves, easily enslaved. They didn't know about weaponry or steel, and they would grab a knife not knowing that it was sharp because they were so simple but so easily enslaved. Well, the Jesuits had a different take on us. The Jesuits said we were a religious and a pious and a healthy community. And they refer to us as enlightened or human beings. We call ourselves Allenbach, human beings. The interesting thing about the Jesuits is said, you know what, they reflect every time we gave them a mass, we made them go to a service, we did whatever. They'd always reflect and debate whatever we said out of the Bible. He said it showed a process of mental agility to deal with these issues. The biggest front that the Jesuits saw was the women kind of ruled the discussion. And they wanted a male-dominant thing because the Catholic Church was male-dominant. And the debate always was there was a friction that the Jesuits would like the men to be more outspoken, but the women appeared to weigh everything that they said. And knowing that, and then looking at us as being savages or cruel, like, do we have that Durham picture up? Yeah, is that up there?
4 photos, I think we've
There was
shown.
only 3?
4, yeah.
The Durham mural, if you're not familiar with it, there's a series of murals in there about colonial life in Durham. And one of them is a garrison, and it shows an indigenous person in the foreground with a torch. And the title is, under it is Cruel Adversity, or is it Adversary? I'm trying to remember what the word.
Cruel adversity.
Adversity. And again, in the construct of what the Jesuits said that the Abenaki were always complaining about the cruelty of the English. Waldron, for example, was it in 1676, somewhere around this, in the late 1600s, Waldron captured 200 Abenaki in a mock battle and meeting, like it was going to, it's a peace meeting, but they were going to have indigenous games, and then they didn't realize that the colonials and the Mohawks that were there had real arms and real weapons. And 200 were rounded up, some were hung, brought back to Boston hung, some were sold into slavery. Just based on that one story, you realize that the cruel adversary wasn't the indigenous population, it was actually the English. And through reading the diaries of the Jesuits, there were several notations that they felt that the English were very cruel in their negotiations. And most of the battles at Oyster River were in retribution. They were not just a haphazard situation. So when we talk about the Piscataway and all these things going on here, and it seems to be a hotbed of conversation of what happened here, because a lot of the colonial engagement was along the coast, you have to look at it from a different lens sometimes. From my perspective, I look at that and I say that garrison of those nameless, faceless people that are hiding in there, I look at it as they were cruel. They were cruel people. Whether or not people interpret it differently is a part of what your culture is. When you look at that, somebody else may say, I'm that white colonial looking out the window that you can't see through, and I'm looking at a cruel adversary out in the fringes of the forest. Well, it's all a matter of perspective, and as we've been going through narratives of a lot of these colonial records, it appears a lot of disinformation was used to promote the killing and extermination of indigenous people and taking of lands. I'm going to wrap this up because I've been told to. I think that as a tea talk, we can get a lot of good questions out of this. So I want to give you a little background on where I come from. I'll just tell you one more thing. The Wabanaki is pretty much a name that applies to everybody from the Donlin. The Jesuits said it meant the ancient people that were here on the coast of Donlin, or the first to observe sunrise. And that goes back in the indigenous community that we were probably, and this has been, we're digging up the research up in Jefferson, that we were here 12,000 years ago as Paleo-indigenous people. And I may, in fact, be a descendant of those people. It's hard to really prove that, but 12,000 years ago, there were indigenous people here on the face of the glacier, and they were called the Wabanakiak. Not the Wabanaki or Abenaki, they're called the Wabanakiak. And that means the ancient people from the place of the Donlin. And I'll end at this point.
Doesn't matter. Next person, that's me. Wow, what an audience. Liz and I were walking up, and I said, there must be something going on here today. Who are all these people? So it's very nice to see everybody here. I am Siobhan Senior. I teach Native American literature at the University of New Hampshire. And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about literature. Paul mentioned that art, images, and stereotypes and history written by the victors can be really damaging. But there's one thing that I've learned by reading a lot of literature, which is that we don't have to accept those images and those damaging narratives, because Native people themselves have been writing a lot. In fact, they probably were writing before English colonizers got here. And certainly after English colonizers got here and sort of foisted alphabetic literacy upon them, they started writing immediately in English for their own purposes, to assert their own autonomy and power. So But I will tell you that I did not set out, I am not Native myself, I did not set out to be a Native American literature scholar. I went to grad school to do a PhD on Thomas Hardy. And I still, and I still love that stuff. If you know Tess of the D'Urbervilles, the strawberry and all that, I still love that stuff. But I took a class by chance on Native American literature in graduate school, and I just got hooked. And I got hooked on having all of my preconceptions just blown out of the water. And I don't think I took this class thinking that I was especially woke. Like, I don't think I thought anything of it, right? But I remember going, the first book we read was a book by Paul Radin, an anthropologist, and it was called The Trickster. It was a collection of stories about tricksters. And I remember being on a canoe trip on Labor Day weekend reading this book and just rolling in the grass laughing because I guess on some level I had expected some sort of mystical wisdom of the elders, and this was all about Coyote farting and eating his own testicles, and they were funny. The stories were funny, and I thought, this is weird. This is weird. And so the Native American literature that I was reading in that class just didn't play by any of the rules that I was expecting of literature. I expect big Victorian novels with lots of psychological interiority, and they played by very different rules, but they were very, very good. I really got hooked. So sometimes when I tell people I teach Native American literature, they go, oh, and then there's a minute and they go, oh, it was all oral, right? And no, it was, yes, of course there are oral traditions. There still are vibrant oral traditions, but Native people have written a lot. They've written novels, they've written poetry, they've written plays, they're on Twitter, they're on YouTube, they're everywhere. You just have to know where to look for them. And I consider it my job as a literary historian to kind of make sure that they're getting help make sure, I can't make sure, but help make sure they're getting a wider audience, the audience that I think that they deserve. When I finished my PhD, I wound up at a seminar at the Newberry Library in Chicago, which is a wonderful place to study Native American history if you ever get a chance to go there. And I was in a seminar where I was the only non-Native person there, and the Native people at the table were very kind to me, but they said, your research is really interesting, but what's in it for us? And that was something else that nobody had ever asked me to think about as a Native, as a literature person. I went to grad school because I like books. I didn't really think I had to talk to people. I'm not really trained to talk to people. I'm not really good at talking to people, but I found out that I was going to have to talk to people. And then I got here at the University of New Hampshire in 2000, and I thought, well, I should really teach the literature of this place. They hired me to teach Native American literature, and yes, I can teach Leslie Marmon Silko and Sherman Alexie and all of those famous writers, but there's literature of this place too, and I kept being told, well, there isn't any. People knew about a minister from the 18th century named Samson Occam, good Lord. Samson Occam, a Mohegan minister from the 18th century. And then from the 19th century, they knew of a Pequot minister named William Apess. And then it was like nothing happened until this guy, Joseph Bruchac, came along in the late 20th century and started writing books faster than any of us can read them. So it was sort of like perpetuating this stereotype, right, that they vanished a long time ago, and that if they're around today, they're just singular, right? They're very unusual. But so by chance, I made a phone call. This was how I did research, right? So I imagined that it would be me, the lone scholar, toiling in the archives, making great discoveries, right? With all of the discovery is a loaded term for non-Native people related to Native history. But I made a random phone call to the Mohegan Tribal Office because I had been assigned to write a short essay about Native American literature for a big encyclopedia of New England culture, if you've ever seen it. It was written by my colleague, edited by my colleagues David Waters and Bert Feintuck. And they said, could you do us a little entry on Native American literature? So I called the Mohegan Tribal Office and I said, you got any writers down there? And the person who answered the phone happened to be Melissa Tantaquidgeon Zobel, who is the Mohegan medicine woman, and who was writing a sci-fi novel at the time. She said, Siobhan, that's an Irish name. I'm writing a sci-fi novel about Irish people and Indian people. And she started telling me about all of these Mohegan women who had been writing over the centuries and whose work everybody at Mohegan knew about and remembered and could quote, even though in many cases they had really not been published outside of their communities. So mind blown, right, for me as a literary historian, mind blown, you know, because I'm in an English department and the sky is always falling in English departments and nobody's reading anymore and books are going out of print in a minute and a half and libraries are dying and bookstores are dying, and I found that there are these communities of people who are keeping their own literary histories alive without any help from the rest of us, right? No fancy grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities. I mean, these literary histories are being kept sometimes in tribal offices, sometimes in tribal museums like at Mohegan, and sometimes in Granny's garage. So I actually enlisted the help of a dozen tribal editors, people I met and invited to my classes over the years, and I said, let's do a book. But you tell me what's important to you, right? You tell me who the important writers are, and I'll just sort of mediate with the publisher. And we published a book called Dawnland Voices. Paul mentioned the Dawnland. It came out a couple of years ago, and it's 700 pages long. It's huge. It's a tome, and even some of the writers said to me after it came out, we had no idea how big this was going to be, right? Even though we knew that we had all of these writers, we had no idea how big this was going to be. And they kept finding more. They kept finding more contemporary writers and more texts in their archives. And this book took 10 years to put together, by the way. And somebody said to me, well, when are we going to do volume 2? And I said, I'll be dead before we do. But we did realize that there's this thing called the internet. And we could use the internet to sort of keep the anthology going. So if you look for dawnlandvoices.org, we actually have a 2-part website. And part of it is a literary magazine for young writers, up-and-coming writers who haven't been published yet. Sometimes we have fancy people in there too, like Joseph Bruchac. And then the other side is for archival work. So Paul didn't mention this, but for decades, he was putting a newsletter out, a really interesting tribal newsletter out of his basement, first on a dot matrix printer, and then with incredible stuff in it, recipes, poetry, editorials, very feisty editorials a lot of times, cartoons, puzzles, really, really interesting stuff. So some of those newsletters are on our website. There's a trove of them on Paul's own website. And that's what we're doing. So I'll just finish with this. One of the things we talk a lot about in Native American studies these days is the concept of recognition. And recognition is sort of interesting to think about in New Hampshire, right? One thing that recognition means is that the federal government, the colonial government, reserves the right to confer recognition upon tribes, and that's really rude, right, in all kinds of ways. And in New Hampshire, we don't have any federally recognized tribes, and we don't have formal reservations. So it's a little bit different here, I think, than being even in a place like Maine, right, where Maine, you know, they see Indian Island, they see the federally recognized Penobscot tribe going to battle with the EPA. What we have in New Hampshire instead are lots and lots of people like Paul and Denise and Liz who are quietly keeping the culture going and quietly doing the work and the activism.
I'm sorry, Paul is quiet?
Never.
Making baskets, doing the writing, doing the work, without recognition from the colonial settler state. And one thing we can do as non-Native people, I think, is give authors and artists and political activists the recognition that they deserve by listening. That's all I got.
Sorry, I had to. I couldn't help myself.
Cute.
Kwai, and Deloise, Elizomba Charlebois, and Dai Warner, Nia Wobonakik. So I just said, hello, my name is Liz Charlebois. I'm from Warner, and I am from the people of the Dawn. I'm Abenaki. So my little intro is going to go in a little bit of a different direction. I definitely am involved in current events, but I'm going to talk more about reclaiming Native culture, which is our tagline here. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I do that. And yeah, I definitely am a political person, as much as I hate the idea of it. But some of the ways that I work on living my Indigenous life and making sure that my traditions and my history continue is by teaching by example. And I do that in a couple ways. I am a parent. I have a 15-year-old who is actually here, probably bored out of her mind right now. And that I drag her kicking and screaming to Native events on a regular basis. And she tries to tell me how much she hates it. But she knows how to grow food. And she knows how to argue with her U.S. history teachers. And she knows how to intellectually dissect history textbooks. So that tells me I'm doing a pretty damn good job. Thank you. And now that I've thoroughly embarrassed her, so I really go through life and try to carry myself in a good way. And I try to stick to the teachings that I have from my parents and from my grandfather and from other elders in my community that I respect. And I try to, stick with those teachings. And I try to be a good role model for Abenaki and youth from other tribes as well. And I keep saying I'm like everybody's auntie. So I have a whole clan of little nieces and nephews right now who actually aren't biologically related to me, but they all consider me auntie. And they respect me, and they watch what I'm doing. And so eventually they're going to model that behavior, and that's going to help keep our community alive. Some other ways that I make a point of reclaiming my Native culture. And I was raised Native. I've been in the Native community my entire life. And I'm actually a little older than I look. I'm 43. So by my saying my community, I'm not talking like 15 years old. So I come from a relatively traditional family. My mother is, as these people can attest, is a relatively strong personality. And she's definitely, she's one of the best people I know. But she is definitely a wealth of knowledge and makes a point of also carrying herself in a good way. And you better believe if I step out of line, my mother is still going to hear about it, which means I'm going to hear about it. So one of the main focuses of the work that I do, and I'm a nurse, so I work in healthcare. It's my job to take care of people, which also, explains the whole auntie thing. I'm a mother. That's what I do. I mother people. But part of that role is feeding people. And feeding people is really important. So one of the main things that I do is I work really hard in food sovereignty and reclaiming foodways. So I am a seed saver. I grow all indigenous plants. I get my seeds from other native seed keepers, and I make sure everything I grow is indigenous, meaning that it came from here. It wasn't imported. And we have a real our food system is very interesting right now because when all those people came over on boats, they also brought their plants with them. They brought their seeds with them. They brought apple trees and they planted them. And that's not to say, I love a good apple. That's not to say I don't love those foods, but they don't belong here. They're not indigenous to this area. Yes, they can grow, but some of these plants are also, they're invasive and they're killing out our indigenous flora, which can be kind of dangerous. Think of, you guys probably all see it along the highway, the bittersweet with those orange berries. That's not indigenous from here. That's a Japanese plant. And it comes in and it kills all the undergrowth. So some of the plants that we have are extremely useful and some of them are not. So part of what I do is trying to stick to the foods that our bodies are meant to be eating. Now, we always hear about alcoholism with Native folks. We hear about diabetes. We hear about congestive heart failure. We hear about hypertension. Well, the reason that Native people have these diseases at a far greater percentage than any other race is because we're not eating a pre-colonial diet. We are not eating the diets that our bodies are genetically made for. And that gets to be dangerous. So, and there are a whole lot of components to that between the introduced foods, between the reservation diets where, Native folks were given what the Army wanted to give them, which was flour and lard. I mean, no wonder you're having heart attacks, So a lot of my work involves teaching about these foodways and preparing foods in an indigenous way and eating more indigenous foods. And my daughter hates it. She hates it. But every once in a while, I force her to eat wild rice or salmon. But it's more complicated than that. It's also there's a component with seed saving and we've all heard of the crying Indian with the litter, who ironically was Italian. He wasn't even Indian. But, there is a relationship between Native folks and nature. It's inherent. It's in our DNA. We are able to survive and still survive despite cultural and actual physical genocide, because that's what this country has gone through. We have gone through genocide. And we are still here. My daughter, my nieces and nephews are an example of, strength and cultural resilience. They are still here. So our relationship with the environment around us is extremely important. And part of that is our relationship with our seeds. A Mohawk elder told me once that when you save a seed, you have to consider it a member of your family. You have to think of it as if you are married to that seed. Any relationship takes work, and that includes the relationship you have with your food. And another friend of mine, Rowan White, who is Akwesasne Mohawk, who actually has a farm in California. She's a little displaced. But she is famous for saying, how can you call yourself sovereign if you can't feed yourselves? So that's why food sovereignty is so important, and eating the foods that your body is made to eat. And it may seem like talking about seeds and food is a little bit off topic, but really it's not, because culture, and we all have traditions surrounded by food. And how do you get food? You grow it. So, and we have planting ceremonies, and we have those relationships with our seeds, and that's what's important. Some other things that we do to sort of reclaim our native culture is language reclamation. My tribe's language is Western Abenaki, and that's the language I introduce myself in. And so I am not fluent, I know that, but every day I try to learn a little bit more, and I try to boost my vocabulary, and I attend language gatherings where we speak in Abenaki, and I yell at my kid in Abenaki. So, she's going to grow up, and her memory of me is, yep, my mom yelled at me in Indian. So, saving a culture is complex and simple all at the same time. It's just the way you live. But there are different steps in that. And, like saving food and saving language is important. But one of the other things, and I think I'm probably close to my time, but I'm going to wrap up here pretty soon. One of the things that we're seeing, especially in New England, is a cultural resurgence. And, there's a quote in here in the little blurb about this talk about how New Hampshire's indigenous people killed off by disease and war. Well, actually, no, that's not what happened. What happened is eugenics, where the state governments actually physically went after Indian people and, undesirable populations, of which Indians were, and had under legal right to medically experiment or sterilize Native folks until the 1970s. So that's within my lifetime. There was a law on Vermont's books. So if it's not safe to be your culture, you do what you can to survive. And sometimes that means those of us who can hide in plain sight, we do that. And so, as Paul mentioned, there was definitely in New Hampshire a concerted effort to write Indians out of history. but that doesn't mean they weren't here. What you see is you'll hear stories of gypsies outside little towns, and those were the Abenakis. So, because what we would do is we would move into communities and live on the outskirts in small family groups. We were never, ever a big settlement tribe like you think of with like the Lakota Sioux or the Dene, the Navajo. That wasn't how our tribe got, we didn't work like that. Most of us don't like each other that much. So, and that's not something new, that's historical. So, when they say all the Abenakis died away, no, that's not true at all. We just got really good at hiding. And it seemed to go in line with what the historians wanted to see. So, hence the Indians living on the edge of the town. Oh no, they're gypsies. They're not Indians. There are no Indians here. Like even in one of the branches in my family did a family genealogy 20 years ago, and she swore up and down there ain't no Indians in this family. Well, I think you're wrong. But anyway, so what we're seeing now is that it's a little safer to be an Indian now. So we're seeing a cultural resurgence. We're seeing more pride. We're seeing more people attending powwows, even though it's not our way, because there's a pan-Indianism. There's it's other tribes. We're finding sisterhood and brotherhood with those other tribes, and they are sympathetic to what we're going through as Eastern people. And so we're seeing more art, we're seeing more music, we're seeing more dance, we're seeing more literature. It's safe-ish right now for us to be who we are. So Eastern people are certainly more visible, not only in our non-Native communities, but also in the greater Native American community at large, which is super important because, it tells us that after 500 years, we're not alone, and that's really nice. But I guess I'm gonna wrap up, and I think we're ready for questions. Yeah.
Well, I want to thank our panelists for opening us up to the dialogue first, and we'll go into Q&A. But I just wanted to mention that there was just an article in Facebook that I saw this morning where they were at a protest in Arizona where they
I wrote that down.
where they just asked one of the Navajo legislator to prove that he was not an illegal.
And it was confirmed by Snopes that this was an actual thing that happened.
It actually happened.
So yeah, he was a Dene congressman that an irate protester demanded to see his papers. We're pretty sure that you're not legal. So.
Okay.
Janet Drew from York, Maine. I just wanted to say, it seems that the country moves from one villain to the next. Mm-hmm. And right now we've moved to new villains. New people are savages. New people have to be abused. Don't have a question.
Yeah, that's unfortunately true. We live in a country, and we've seen this over the last 2 years, I think, where differences were celebrated and protected to an environment where it's not safe to be brown. Mm-hmm. I understand that I'm a pale brown person, but I still am a brown person. And I remember the day after the election, there were a lot of people who were like, "You're overreacting for being afraid." But yet I'm seeing posts from my Native cousins, brothers, uncles, who, in a very real sense, could lose their lives because of the color of their skin. So we live in a very frightening time right now. And you're right, there is always someone who is the bad guy. And, you know, the media certainly contributes to that.
Hi, I'm Angela Matthews. Thank you for that really wonderful program. It was just so interesting. So my question is, recently, maybe within the last year, 6 months, there were stories in the paper about a reconciliation project in Maine among the Native American population in that state. And something that was, I was so moved by, that it took place all over Maine, and surprised to see that the governor of Maine actually went and represented the state at this and was very respectful in the process. And they had a closing ceremony for this reconciliation process that took place statewide. And I'm curious to know if something like that is going to happen in New Hampshire, which I think would be a really exciting and wonderful thing to do.
Our exposure, at least our tribal exposure to Concord, has been a mixed bag, to say the least. We championed the legislation for the Commission of Native American Affairs back a few years ago, and it was a difficult process. I was not prepared for the racism that was bandied about by our elected officials, especially in closed-door caucuses, which it was shameful conduct. They justified it because they said they had killed us all off because they came from colonial Yankee roots, and they, according to their family histories, we were all killed, and anybody that's left here is not what they are. That we're French people that snuck back or whatever. But this goes back to that whole discussion about where does racism really evolve from. I mean, you deal with the unknown and ignorance, and that breeds that fear, and we've all heard these cycles of racism, and fear brings anger and the other things that attributed to racism. We think the best way to deal with a lot of this is through education, and hence why we're spending a lot of our time. We do PowerPoint presentations all over the state as requested. Yeah, we don't demand to be heard, but we're getting an interesting following, and things are changing here in this area. Over at Old Berwick, Maine, that historical society has been bringing in a lot of Native American literature into the Berwick Academy and having a presentation every month. And that happened all last year. It was interesting because it was a mixture of academics and indigenous writers as well. And people are starting to re-examine the cultural paradigms that were here. I've been lecturing for years about a guy named Kenneth Morrison who wrote The Embattled Northeast. I didn't realize I was promoting a book that's now become so expensive to buy that I couldn't buy another copy of it because it's become a rarity. But he talks about the 7 paradigms, especially in the Piscataway area, although he never really identifies it as such. He talks about 7 paradigms which shaped what happened to the Wabanaki, the Abenaki. And in it he included the common things, the disease, warfare, land, settlement, and a whole bunch of other. There were 7 constructs that he analyzed, but it came down to, again, that education against that fear of who we were was what really shaped us. And yes, we did get acculturated, assimilated into the culture. Did we know English? Yes, we knew some English, we knew some French, we probably knew Latin. So we were a pliable community that was worked with the Jesuits, unfortunately, and we are monotheistic, and Angela first learned that. I know Angela from Star Island, and we've worked for years with Angela. At first, the Unitarians thought we were a polytheistic culture, and the Jesuits always said we were monotheistic. We actually had to adopt our religion to fit in with the Catholicism to some extent, and we created specific words because to us the Creator was a mystery. It wasn't a male or female entity. So the Jesuits had a hard time with that. And remember I talked about the women running the show. Oftentimes when we talk to the priests that are in the federal system working on Bureau of Prisons, we refer to the God as the Holy Mother. So we always get a little stir out of them by saying that. The key thing here is education, and we have an intern team working with the anthropology and archaeology department in UNH. And we're trying to reshape what the Abenaki looked like, one person at a time, sometimes one school at a time. It's just like the mascot issue. People always beseech us to step in and referee these battles. This has to start at the grassroots level. We have to change how we think through education of our children, and it's going to take time. It's like Columbus Day. We're battling that battle right now in the State House under HB 1604 to change Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. As you know,
You
Durham...
can clap, it's okay.
Now, that's all Indigenous people, though, you know? You got to think about that. And it's a big push. We have some opposition from, some top Italian politicians in the state, and we won't mention any of them because they're very well-known people. But they're the same people that push for casinos, so it's kind of like a two-edged sword,
Well, and that actually leads me to a point, too, to answer your question, is that, as far as any sort of reconciliation with New Hampshire, they'd have to first admit that we exist. New Hampshire has a very head-in-the-sand approach when it comes to Native folks. And let's think about the climate right now. There are federally recognized tribes in Maine. There are federally recognized tribes in Massachusetts. There are state-recognized bands in Vermont, and there are Canadian First Nations in Quebec. So all around New Hampshire, there is recognition for Indigenous people, but we are somehow in the black hole of there not being any Indians here. So tell me how that happened, because I'm a little confused. If New Hampshire admits that there are actually Indigenous people here that have always been here, that means they have to, do stuff. Mm-hmm. And they can't, and they are, it does, well, probably not as much as you think. But I think, yes, in their minds, I think that there is a huge amount of fear on the legislators' part that if we gain some sort of recognition, we're going to have a casino in Concord. Let's be honest. How economically viable are the casinos that the state are going to run? Are we going to follow a failing business model? I mean, I don't think so. So, one of the ways that, and I'm going to speak for Paul here a little bit, and for myself and other Native folks in New Hampshire, one of the ways that we combat that and get around that idea of there aren't any Indians in New Hampshire is that we make ourselves visible. Whenever the paper asks us for an interview, we go on record that our name is there and that we say that we're Abenaki. We go on record saying that we're an artist, that we're an activist, that we're, the work that we're doing. Because if it's in the public record that there are Abenakis in New Hampshire, in Concord, in 2018, then chances are pretty good there are Indians in Concord in 2018.
We have a question.
Okay.
Thank you. My name is Charlene McCall, and it's not a question, it's advice and guidance. My great-grandmother was a Cherokee, but because of, like Paul said, the discrimination of their generation, it was not documented. We didn't have that documentation. And I want to find out, what do I need to do to, I know her name, but where do I go to find that? Because, our records just weren't there.
Well, the Cherokee used the Dawes rolls. This is the unfortunate time in Jackson's period where, the rolls of the Cherokee were established. We know there were mixed freed slaves, living with the Cherokee as well. The Cherokee did kind of like push out the darker, community family people. I don't know how that actually got resolved because they were accused of lateral racism, of forcing out their own people. But that's not uncommon with federally recognized tribes. I mean, we've done a lot of case studies of the Mashantucket Pequot, and that's a mixed group. And when Skip Haywood took, that initial step to threaten the federal and state government to get, Mashantucket Pequots recognized, he was, he basically got forced out of his own tribal council over time. But it's just funny how those paradigms work of internal racism within groups, and that it still exists to some extent. The Abenaki have always denied there are any black Abenaki, but we are pretty sure we've documented there were. And it comes down to the Gilmanton area. There was a story, and we thought it was funny because Channel 9, you know, the Fritz Weatherby thing, he talked about Portsmouth at some point. We think it was probably the slaver hunt, the slaver that, you know, went from Africa to this continent and kept on stealing slaves and going back, about the same time as John Smith. And Fritz Weatherby said that there were escape off of a ship off of somewhere at the coast here, and 4 people swam ashore. The way Fritz identified it were 2 African slaves that were not yet into the slave trade, but were being taken there, and 2 indigenous people, and they jumped ship and swam to shore. And we follow that story to Gilmanton, and we think it was the Plassoir and Sabatis, which it turned out that they were indigenous people. They escaped, went up to St. Francis, to Odenak, and 2 African people that were with the 2 indigenous people from here were baptized St. Francis and St. Sebastian and St. Francis, hence Sabatis and Plassoir. And there's a story about this, and we followed this line, and so did the Pequots. They were really interested because they've been trying to find African Americans that married into the tribal groups earlier than expected. You know, everything is kind of later. After the Civil War and just before the Civil War, there was a lot of marriages, but this is going way back in colonial time period. But even our Abenaki in Canada said, oh, there were never any black people here, but we're pretty sure that there were some intermarriages way, way back, that far back. So the French in the indigenous community are basically colorblind. There's no shadation. And we found historically the French seemed to marry every indigenous community they ever went to, whereas the English were very narrow-minded about intermarriage.
It's because everybody hated the English.
Right. So, enough said. Another question. I think we
Yeah,
get
we
off
have another
topic,
question
yeah.
right here.
I just want to thank you for your presentations because it's an education for, I'm sure, a lot of us here. Oops, sorry. And I'm Bobby Beavers. I'm from South Berwick. And I do have some brochures this year. We continue Forgotten Frontiers and more lectures at Berwick Academy. And also, we're now open January, February, March, and April on the 4th Saturday of the month. So hope some will come and visit it.
That's a good plug.
Anyway, the other thing I wanted to comment on was this Truth and Reconciliation Commission that our state of Maine formed. And it accomplished a lot of good things. And the governor may have attended at some point, but as a person who spent, not last year, but the previous 6 years in the Maine legislature, I can tell you that I had to sadly walk out with 2 of our tribal members out of the chamber. They were recalled by their tribes because of the disrespect of our governor. And so it isn't, and I can remember, I mean, that how much effort it was to try and restore language, their language. And, but I know that there is also a fair amount of Native literature in Maine as well. And anyway, I'm hoping in a few months that we'll see something different and somebody who is supportive of our tribes. And I think we are the only state in the nation that has 3 tribal members, although 2 of them are missing. I don't know if either of those 2 came back for this session because I haven't been there. But we had 3, and they, and there is a 4th tribe that is recognized but is not represented, and that's the Micmac. But they're a wonderful group of people that I enjoyed working with, and I found very helpful some of the work that I did there. And so I hope at some point you get recognized in New Hampshire and can be part of your legislature too.
Let me just talk about recognition a little bit. People think, why don't you just do it? Why don't you get recognition? And you don't quite understand the principle. Typical of Washington, they made it into an almost an impossible mission. The tribes that have been more recently recognized, like the Mashpee Wampanoag, spent millions of dollars to pursue their recognition. They went through almost to 2 or 3 generations of people. Their petition was languishing for 25 years, something like that. And they actually set case law, and I follow indigenous case law. It's what you call U.S. Title 25, or Indian laws, U.S. Code. A tribe can only be made or terminated by Congress, and most of the groups that were recognized by the federal government, it's almost like a two-edged sword. Usually, in the early days, in the 1930s, tribes were forced to put that the President of the United States is their supreme chief of their tribes. And the president, they always assumed it was a male president, by the way, that he could determine, terminate them at any point, or Congress could. So after Mashpee went for a land claim down on the Cape, they were deemed not a tribe by a federal judge under another in a prosecution on a land claim. And it turned out it set case law that the Wampanoag didn't have to prove they were indigenous. They had a legitimate land claim. Another case occurred up in Missisquoi with the Swanton, Vermont group of Missisquoi Abenaki, where they were trying to repatriate. Set another case law because they were denied to repatriate their human remains that were dug up in a place called Monument Road. Yeah. And it said another case law, and it said a tribe is a tribe as long as they declare themselves a tribe. And you cannot deny that. So I started doing research on constitutional issues. Turns out we're recognized by Washington. The Abenaki are recognized by Washington during the Revolution. But laws and treaties were made, the Jay and the Intercourse Act, with 2 of them, which were supposed to protect us so we could cross back and forth to Canada and maintain our homelands here, all of which fell apart very quickly because they displaced us. When you look at that issue, and then you look at what happens in Concord when we went through the Commission of Indian Affairs issue, right on the House floor, the first thing they did in the debate was they brought up my name, and I wasn't on the bill. I shouldn't have, my name doesn't associate with the bill at all. But they brought up my name and said, yeah, that Pulio is going to be building a casino at Sunapee. Well, it goes back to APYS service release that was done probably by D'Alessandro, and we're in the APYS service, and I, at the time, controlled about 140 acres butting up to Mount Sunapee. They put 2 and 2 together that we were planning to work with Okemo to build a casino in Sunapee. So here's the poor postmaster, who was also the head of the selectmen. She had to deal with the YS service. Shaheen had to deal with the YS service, and I had to deal with the YS service. That none of us knew what was going on. But that change, that gossip was 20 years old, and it came up on the House floor recently when the commission was formed in, what year was that?
It was like 7 years ago.
7 years ago. And I mean, 20 years later, they're still bringing up, oh, you damn Indians are here and you're going to build a casino. And that wasn't part of the discussion. It was about getting a commission to deal with indigenous affairs. So is there a prejudice? Will the state ever recognize us? I really doubt it. They are so set that every time that we bring up anything about indigenous people, they talk land claims, casinos, welfare, and all the negative things that don't have anything to deal with our recognition as a people. And it's unfortunate, but that's the way it is. Will we ever get state recognition? What happened in Vermont may never happen here in New Hampshire. There's a strong prejudice, and we're not going to change it unless we change our whole... This is going to be a generational thing, bluntly. People think being in a tribe, you just declare it. There's 7 issues when you declare yourself as a tribe. Everybody thinks just show your genealogy and you're all set. The devil in this is one of them, and it says you have to show continued governance for the last several generations, maybe 100 years.
I think it's 100 years.
100 years. How do you show tribal governance. They're looking for a chief, a war council, a whole hierarchy, when we're nothing more. And I'm going to tell you another little side story, because I love to tell, that's why they say I never stop talking. The Abnaki, the Wabanaki, consider ourselves all an extended family. And that extended family, as we've determined what happened to the Wabanaki, what happened to the Abnaki, we noticed some small footnotes. The Abnaki considered the Penobscot a sister tribe, the Wampanoag a cousin tribe. We were so extended that we referred to ourselves as relational family members. That tribe is an uncle tribe. That one's a grandfather tribe. So what happened after those paleo indigenous people dispersed? They recognized that this was a cousin, uncle, an aunt, a sister, or brother who left and formed another tribe. Not a different tribe, just another place named tribe. So with all that confusion, the federal government wants us to identify each one of us as a separate entity with its own tribal governance, when in fact we were related all by grandmothers. So welcome to the problem of identifying and proving to the federal government we still exist. I could go on and on. So
He could. I see that you have a question, but I just wanted to add something really quickly that's actually very surprising that came out of this administration. Last week, there were actually, I believe, 6 tribes in Virginia that were granted federal recognition, and Trump signed off on it. So these are Eastern tribes that have been going through the same issues that the Abenaki people that have been going through that now have federal recognition.
It's a possibility,
Signed it. I'm very surprised.
but culturally, okay, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Ken Jeremiah from Newmarket, New Hampshire.
Hi.
And you guys have done a marvelous job. You've done a marvelous job of bringing us up to date on what treatment of the indigenous people has been since its early days up until the current time. Is the USA unique in this respect in its treatment of indigenous people, both historically and currently? Or how do we compare?
Well, you know, that's tough. Canada also has a very contentious relationship with their Native people. I think that the current PM is better as far as Indigenous people and the whole Walking with Our Sisters movement. I'm not sure if people are familiar with that. Walking with Our Sisters is a movement that brings attention to the highly disproportionate amount of Indian women that are missing and murdered every year and not investigated. Just being an Indigenous woman increases your risk of being abducted or murdered exponentially. So there was a huge movement, I would say, 4 or 5 years ago to really bring these to light. And this was when Stephen Harper was still PM of Canada. And most of these cases were never investigated, or they were slipped under the rug. And so it was an active movement of Native people and their allies really bringing this to light and trying to affect systems change. And I believe that it has, and Mr. Trudeau has certainly helped with that. However, we also see Canada with the tar sands and the pipelines that are destroying Indigenous communities and boreal forests and really extremely pollutant materials in our land and our water sources. So to say that the United States is unique, I don't think so. And just as a little aside, Hitler's plan for the concentration camps and his anti-Semitic policies were based on the United States' treatment of the indigenous population. Yeah. So just think about that for a second, and also think about the direction our country is going in now and how this life is so terrifying. So I think that wherever you have a colonizer attitude, manifest destiny, let's get more land. Wherever that attitude is, you're going to run into some contentious relationships with the Native folks. You know, our idea of land ownership is different, and that is part of where the issue is. However, you know, even going back to this cruel adversity thing and the Oyster River and all the conflict, think about this. And I love this meme on Facebook that I saw about either Columbus Day or Thanksgiving, take your pick, about saying, you know, let's celebrate Columbus Day. We're going to move into somebody's house, kill them, and tell them it's ours now. So this is manifest destiny. We have, and this is the tenet that our country was built on. We need to get more land. Who cares who lives there? It's ours now. The moon landing, let's put a flag on it. It belongs to the United States. So as long as we have this attitude as a society, and, you know, natives have dual citizenship, we're Americans too. As long as we have this mindset, I don't see where it's going to be any different, because, you know, like we talked about before, this lady over here mentioned there's always another Indian, there's always another savage, there's always another enemy. You know, that's how it's a psychological thing. That's how we justify being horrible to other people. We justify that they're terrible, and that makes us sleep at night. So as long as our government is based on that type of philosophy, I don't think there's going to be any change, unfortunately.
Hi, my name is Jack Panopoulos. Thanks a lot for sharing your persistence and the joy of your cultures. My question has to do with, and I don't know what the other 6 points of proving that you are a tribe, but in reference to a change that happened at Yosemite in the last 2 years, the Ahwahnee Hotel changed its name to the Majestic Yosemite Hotel. And I understand this went through patent office and a bunch of United States departments in the government. Are there any iconic places in New Hampshire in which the native names are being scrubbed that you know of, that you could share with us, in favor of something which is more nouveau, iconic for America?
Yeah. So I actually think something, I actually see what we're seeing actually now in Native communities is kind of the opposite. What we're doing is we're naming place names with their original names in the appropriate language. So what we see in New England is a lot of pan-Indian, oh, this sounds Indian-ish names. You know, several of our place names are actually based on our language, like the Connecticut River, the Kentucky River. Those are sort of bastardized versions of Abenaki words for those places. But there is, along with our language reclamation projects, an effort to take place names and call them their original names, what they are in our actual languages, and not some like Lakota language or just some made up Wani Washi Mushu or whatever. So that's actually, I think, really important, because there's power in words, you know, and, you know, like Paul said, we're monotheistic. We talk to God every day. Whether we do it in a church or not is different. I mean, our spirituality, I think, is a little different. We're not go to church on Sunday religion. We're spiritual beings all the time. And having a connection with a place with the words in our own language is really powerful. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I actually really support the changing of place names to reflect what they've always been called, you know. I had another point and it's gone, but.
Let me just, in 2014, you know, this area was all wrapped up in the John Smith 400. And our tribal governance decided to work with Star Island on a counterpoint about indigenous exploration versus, you know, European exploration. Smith got a lot of record for, you know, he was really a real estate salesman, and people didn't realize that. But because everything you want to do is try to sell New England to the colonial royalty. But what's interesting is, again, Angela was a sweetheart on this. She invited us to give a counterpoint to what the landscape looked like. And we did a whole study of the place names in this area and about navigation, how indigenous people navigated. And what we did is we really did navigation by what we call descriptive geography, not geometry, but geography. All of our place names were actually physically a description of the location. And a lot of those got morphed. One of the classics is Gonic, which is part of Rochester. The original name was quite long, but it referred to a place of high ground where you could spearfish salmon. And all that's left of that now is Gonic, which is the last few letters. But the pushback is that there are certain documents out there that were done in the 50s, and it has a lot of the place names and the original names. The Abenaki attributed to naming everything at one time or another, and this may be just coincidence because we speak an Algonquin dialect L, sometimes referred to Western Abenaki or Central Abenaki. Sometimes even linguists call it the Pennaquik language of New Hampshire to differentiate it from the Penobscot, which is a sister tribe. Remember I said sister tribe. So if you look at all of this, we place names a lot of things. Mississippi is a direct translation of our language. Kansas is a direct translation of the place of the poplars, I think? No. I'm trying to remember what the tree was. But it seems like a lot of the place names across the country are Algonquin-based, and people don't realize it anymore. In New Hampshire, it's loaded. Other than the fact we have a lot of old English town names in between all these, there are a lot of place names that still exist today. Part of our project with UNH is we're dealing with an indigenous landscape project where we're taking New Hampshire and we're repopulating it with the indigenous place names and the events that occurred there. And we're trying to build a construct of a dialogue of what the colonials said about Oyster River, what we called it, and what really happened in the perspective of indigenous people or the Jesuits. So what we're trying to do is, it's an educational process. I mentioned that before. You're going to change the people around you to change that fear of unknown to something of knowledge-based, and realize we've always been here, part of the fabric. You hear this now all the time now with immigration. The Abenaki are part of the fabric of New England, just like everything else. And you can't take the weave out. We're still here, and we add that color to the community and our history. So that being said, yes, place names are still quite prominent here.
Are we changing any of the native
Let me just give you
the opposite?
let me give you a case study.
English names?
Yep, I'm going to give you one. Do you remember how everybody was all upset about the U.S. Geological Survey Group, and they had so many places called Squaw? This was a big push. They were trying to get rid of indigenous things that were felt to be derogatory. So the first case that I got was, believe it or not, Narragansett territory, and I questioned what the purpose of the federal government came to hold me. They said, well, we want to change the name of an island called Aquidneck, which is in the Narragansett Bay. And I said, well, why don't you talk to Narragansetts? And they, well, they won't talk to us. And I said, well, that's typical, but what do you want to change it to? We want to change it to Rhode Island's Rhode Island. And I said, I can't wrap my head around this. I don't understand the point. Now, is it the roads or is it the island? I don't quite understand. So I went through a whole, I just dissected it because the Elgic dialect allows us to dig deep, and I used some references from the Natick Dictionary, which is a smorgasbord of Algonquin language, and determined that the island actually represented a real place name of importance. It was a place where the cross currents coming out of the Narragansett Bay have like a riptide because the ocean currents meet the river currents, and it's a place where a canoe would stop because it meets the two divergent water streams. And I said it was significant to the Narragansetts because it was a place where they knew the current was going to change, and it was the root words "qui," which was a stopping point. So I put it back to them, and I don't think they changed it. I think they respected the fact that it had some significance in its place name. It wasn't just an arbitrarily Squaw Hill or Squaw Pond or something. It actually meant something to somebody, and I said it'd be a shame to change that because it really had significance historically. So I think they left it alone, but that's the absurd stuff that goes on out there in Washington, you know.
I was interested when you mentioned that the indigenous people probably knew Latin, because I had asked several years ago several people how our river out here got its name. So maybe you can explain it further. Piscataqua.
Well, Piscataqua is still referred, you know, different colonial constructs say it was the Deer River, the Deep or Dark River. We still stick with it was deep or dark, you know, just like the Merrimack is kind of a similar thing. It's a deep, dark river. You know, it's a devil in the detail because it's anglicized, so you kind of have to break down the language and try to figure out what the word actually was. The biggest gripe I have personally, is historians, contemporary historians have labeled the Wares Beach area as Aquadatin, and the A-Q-U-A is definite, and to us that's Latin. And we think whatever happened was somebody asked an indigenous person of the time, what is this place called? And for the lack of being able to describe it in Abenaki or an Algonquin dialect, use Latin to describe the location as an aqueduct or a narrowing point. Now, we had it as weirs, a fishing place, but we could not convey that to them because they didn't know what a weir fishing was. So that's one construct that I think was a definite sign that we knew Latin. But the Jesuits said they taught us Latin because they were teaching us the Bible. So 1614, you know, Norwich Walk in that area, I'm sure we were learning Latin. There's a belt called the Mother of Mary belt. We call it Mary belt. It's in the Schatz Museum, in France, in the church museum. I've been to dissertations about the belt in Quebec by experts, and they said they've analyzed the belt so many times, the Catholic Church has and other linguistics experts, and they said there's no coincidence here. The Abenaki were venerating the Mother of Mary, and that's why they made the belt, because the grandmother was the important one in the family, not just Mary was the grandmother. With that being said, they said they were pretty sure that the Abenaki knew enough Latin to even make wampum belts that were in the Latin form. They even said the way the beads were placed, it signified they were following what the Jesuits, who were scholars in the church at the time, how they wrote and how they interpreted Latin. So I have a feeling, yes, we did know Latin to some extent. Not everybody, but some of those that had more exposure may have known Latin.
Dave Drucker from Dover. I'm just wondering if you Abenaki guys have direct contact with the Wampanoag Language Project, and if so, how you're benefiting and how they're benefiting.
Absolutely. Actually, Jennifer Weston, who is the director of the Wampanoag Language Program, is actually a friend of mine, and we've presented in different things together. She's actually not Wampanoag. Mm-hmm. She is Standing Rock Sioux. But the Wampanoag Language Reclamation Project is extremely interesting. I'm not sure if you are aware of the history, but the Wampanoag language actually hadn't been used. There were no native speakers anymore. The Abenaki, we have a few native speakers, and our language is sort of limping along. But one of the things that we have is we have a lot of written resources, and we have, I would say, 5 or 6 different language programs right now that all kind of work together, which is super important because getting Abenakis in a room together and having them play nice is sometimes interesting.
It is.
But I think the difference between the Wampanoag community and the Abenaki community is really geographical. The Wampanoags still live in community structures. They are able to have their immersion schools, you know, from from pre-K to, and I think they probably even go up through high school now, where the kids, the primary language in those schools is Wampanoag. And that's really great considering what, probably 10 years ago, there was not a single Wampanoag speaker alive. So Jesse Baird really dug that language up from the ashes, and now they have Wampanoag, first generation native speakers of that language, which is really impressive. So that means that there are Wampanoag children whose first language is Wampanoag. You know, that's impressive, given that the language was not spoken by anyone. So how Wampanoag and Abenaki relate is that we are both Algonquin languages. There are differences between our languages because the way Algonquin languages work, and Paul mentioned that a lot of those other place names in places far away from here are Algonquin-based languages. And the reason for that is, you know, language development in this continent is pretty complex, and we have major differences in language development. And by the way, language development is one of the ways that the Bering Strait theory was kind of disproven, because the languages here were too complex to have developed in a short amount of time. You're nodding your head, so I see that you already understand this concept. But Algonquin languages is one of the bigger bases of language. So if you think in terms of Europe, you have your Romance languages, so your Spanish, your Italian, those languages that are all different, but they're really kind of similar. And then you have, like, what is it, the Cyrillic languages, so like Russian and those ones that have a different alphabet and completely different from the Romance languages, but they all kind of coexist in a relatively small area. So that's what you're seeing over here as well. So it's really not a stretch to see Algonquin-based languages in other parts of the country, because they probably spoke a different dialect of an Algonquin language. So that's the difference between the Abenaki and the Wampanoag. Do I see us getting to the place where the Wampanoags are now? That's a really difficult question, and like I said, that really has to do with geography. There are a lot of Abenaki in New Hampshire and Vermont and Quebec. However, we don't really live close together, whereas the Wampanoags, especially the Mashpee Wampanoags, which is where this reclamation project is centered, they all live within a town or two of each other. So it really wouldn't be possible for me to send my kid to the same school that somebody from the North Country is going to, simply because of distance. And that sounds like a really, really lame excuse, but unfortunately that's the reality of it. I think that the Abenaki, I'm gonna say a dialectic here. The Abenaki are working really hard on language, but they could be working harder, if that makes sense. So we're doing our very best, but we could be doing better. So we're getting there, but it is a work in progress.
I would mention that the Bruchaks, in particular Jesse, he has two young children. He started teaching them sign language and Abenaki as well as English, and it shows that it can work. What he did is, with the combination of the three, he was able to not vocalize but use hand symbols in symbology, like sign language, to convey these things, and the kids really picked up on it. The problem is, she's right, we've applied for federal grants to protect our language, and the only pushback they've always said is you don't have a contiguous community to really promote this, and it's unfortunate. We're spread out. Calvin Calloway, he's the head of the Indigenous Studies in Dartmouth at the time when I knew him. He always said, through diaspora, the Abenaki spread out all across the country. And it was common sense what was happening. I look at our language like she said, is like a Romance language. We speak Latin, essentially, in an Algonquin paradigm. Our language has always been accused of being the archaic form of Algonquin. We could read what the Wampanoags were doing when they did their language program, as well as the Ojibwa. So if it's true that we have one of the ancient root languages here, much like Latin evolved into French and Spanish and Italian and other things, we are looking at an interesting time period. We may, in fact, be what I've just said. We're the ancient ones of the Algonquin family grouping. Unfortunately, sometimes being the oldest one, you get neglected. We've tried really pretty hard. You can tell the people here are very passionate about protecting the Abenaki. And because we're so passionate, we become dysfunctional because we're all very territorial about protecting our community. So
we have a question right here.
if you have a question, yes, let's go for it. I could go on.
He can.
It's kind of a silly question, but I agree that I think the change will come from education, from the new babies that are born, starting with the new babies that are born. So it makes me wonder, are there any Native American traditions that we Europeans in this country celebrate, even though we don't, unawares kind of, that we are carrying on a Native American tradition and not even know it, other than a powwow party maybe. And also, Portsmouth is such a food town. There's more seats here for eating than there are people here. Is there ever in their country, are there any Native American restaurants?
I can actually speak to
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
That's right up my alley.
Yeah.
Yes, as a matter of fact, there are. The indigenous food movement is exploding right now, and I happen to count myself very fortunate to kind of be in the middle of this. I have some really close friends who are indigenous chefs and who are really, really involved with food justice. And I am not a classically trained chef, but I've somehow, through my cooking ability, been kind of pushed into this group. And, you know, I'm sort of like the shy one in the corner saying, please count me, you know. But there are some really exciting food things going on, especially in the Great Lakes and the Southwest areas. A man that I know is named Sean Sherman, and he is Anishinaabe and Lakota, I believe. And he's based in the Twin Cities in Minneapolis, St. Paul, Minnesota. And his business is called The Sioux Chef. It's kind of a play on words, yep. And his focus is all pre-colonial indigenous fare. And he's actually in the process of opening a restaurant right now. I do believe there's also a restaurant in New York. I can't think of what the name of it is off the top of my head. But also at the National Museum of the American Indian, the Mitzi Tom restaurant is spearheaded by an indigenous chef. And they actually frequently have my friend who is a indigenous Mexican chef. He actually goes there and does programming there a lot. So we are seeing a lot more focus on indigenous diets. And one of the organizations that I belong to, it's relatively new, is called the I Collective. And so feel free to look them up on Facebook. And what the I Collective is doing is we're really trying to decolonize our diets and decolonizing education about food. In November around Thanksgiving, and unfortunately, I'm in the middle of nursing school, so I wasn't able to actually attend the event, but helped with the planning of it. They actually had a series of pop-up dinners in New York City at a couple different restaurants where they cooked a price per plate dinner at these restaurants over Thanksgiving. And they also did an indigenous dinner for the New York City community house. Which was really, really cool. So there is some really exciting food stuff coming our way, and I think we're going to be seeing more and more restaurants popping up. The one difficulty that we are seeing is that there are a lot of non-natives opening restaurants with Native American inspired dishes. And that's problematic because then you get into the area of cultural assimilation and appropriation. Because they're saying it's inspired, they feel that it's getting them around that the appropriation part of it, when in fact, you know, it's non-native people benefiting from indigenous diets and marketing, and that's very problematic. So I guess. I'm not going to lecture you guys. You all seem fairly intelligent, but So I'm just gonna, put a quick warning out and just be a good consumer and make sure you do the research. If you really want to be supporting Native American cuisine and communities, make sure that you're researching. If you're actively seeking out places to eat Native American fare, make sure that it's actually like a Native American chef and that the diets are actually Native American instead of, some of these lookalikes.
Liz, I was really struck earlier as you were talking about your work saving seeds and trying to kind of reclaim indigenous food crops. But I'm wondering if you can talk kind of more broadly about that intersection between conservation and cultural heritage and the revitalization of that and how those intersect. And maybe beyond foodstuffs and thinking about the landscape of New Hampshire, the flora and the fauna more generally, and whether there's overlap at this point and what that looks like in this area.
Absolutely, there is definitely overlap. And if I accidentally leave out part of your question, just certainly let me know. The difficulty, when I was talking about introduced invasive plants before, the difficulty that we're going to have now with having a completely 100% pre-colonial diet is where do we separate the introduced species from the non-introduced species? They're everywhere, from things like our medicines to their foods, like apples are a perfect example. So I guess the way that I view that is, how do I stay true to my culture, but still utilize foods that aren't necessarily part of my indigenous heritage? So is that kind of where you're going? So the short and simple answer to that is Indian people are very adaptable, and we're going to use what's available to us. So you know what? I use Velcro. I drive a car. I take showers. Because Indians really are very clean, most of us. So, I strive to use things that I know are not introduced. So as far as my crops and my seed saving, even if I decide to grow something that maybe is not an indigenous seed, I might not save that seed. You know what I mean? Like, I really make a point of fostering strains of plants that I know are indigenous and that it's the same type of food that my ancestors would have eaten. And I do that by keeping my crops pure. And so that goes down into the ceremony and the relationship with the seeds and knowing how your seeds grow, knowing the soils that they grow in, knowing the growing conditions, knowing what they pollinate with. It's a science, really. And so I think that people tend to forget that indigenous folks, we are very scientific. We are extremely intelligent. We are extremely logical. And so we understand plant science. We understand farming science. And in case people weren't aware, our farmers are our women. And that may seem like a little bit of a culture shift to a lot of folks in the room, but the reason for that is that growing food, feeding people is an extension of the life-giving cycle. Women are our life givers, so it's our responsibility to also feed you. We're helping bring plants to life. And so it's really an extension of our roles as women. Now, why do we see in the greater community male farmers? Well, and this is a slightly off topic, but still pertinent. During the reservation school era, there was a real effort, a concerted effort to make what was the quote? To make take the savage out of the Indian, essentially. And so the way that they were taking the savage out of the Indian is, cutting their hair, beating them if they spoke their own languages, but then teaching them real skills. And so what they were doing is they were teaching the men to farm, thinking that, they were making them more acceptable members of society, but what they didn't realize that they were doing is emasculating our men. And that's not to say that women were considered subservient. Native American cultures are very concerned with balance. So everybody has their role, whether male, female, two-spirited, whatever, and I'm not saying that we have two set genders, because we don't. We have many different genders, but what's important is everybody had their place in our community, and everybody had a role. So whether if you were female, you had a certain set of protocol. And if you were a male, you had a certain set of protocol. If you were two-spirited, you had a certain set of protocol. Everybody had their role based on who they were. And whenever you're asked to do a role of a part of your community that you're not, you're going to feel some disorientation. You're going to feel some lack of self. And so that's what these reservation schools, these residential schools really did, is by teaching our men to farm, they were taking away their identity as Indian men and giving them the role of another gender. So to go back to what you're saying, the intersection between like a contemporary culture and my traditional culture as a farmer is I really am doing my very best to have that relationship with my plants, with my seeds, and forming those marriages, and doing the very best by my plants that I can. Now, a lot of our traditions throughout, eugenics and assimilation have been lost. But on the same hand, my food grows for me, so I'm doing something right. Does that make sense? So I think the important part is just I try to carry myself in the best way that I can, and I try to honor, the history of the seeds, but also, keeping in mind that it's a symbiotic relationship. I care for my seeds, so they care for me. You know what I mean? I hope that answers your question.
I'd like to speak too a little bit about the food thing, food issues, food waste. I've done a lot of studies on this, and I've come to kind of like a contradictory interpretation of our agricultural means. The three sisters, we always talk about the beans, squash, and the corn. We also, we've pretty much determined that they weren't indigenous to the New England area, obviously. They came up from the Southwest or South America. So where do you take your snapshot in time? Everything I've researched, and this came from oral discussions with my father, we were four-season fishermen, first and foremost, not farmers. And as we look at the middens that are all over the place, remnants of fishing and shellfish processing, I should say, it turns out that the paleo diet didn't have grains in it like we expect. Like when you look at paleo diet, if you really want to go back to what the indigenous diet looked like, it was, I think the major source of protein came from fish. And when you look at the Amazon and other indigenous people that are still quite primitive in these isolated places, hunting primates put you in an adversarial position of going into territories of other people, and that leads to warfare and conflict. Whereas fishing, if you look at every place name in New Hampshire, there's Nemaskag, these are all like places that were named for fishing. And it's no coincidence, Garnick was another fishing place. Every place was labeled a fishing place, and what we do find is that probably our indigenous diet was more fish-oriented. If you had to look at changing time periods, working with archaeologists, we're trying to figure out when did corn, beans, and squash really get introduced to you? Because then it made us more sedentary, because if you look at our foodways, we had 5 major villages per year, seacoast, a fishing place, a place for hunting moose and doing maple syrup production. There were different places for different purposes, and it was really following a foodways. What we can tell you is that the suspicion is that we did trade seed stock with other indigenous groups to bring better crops here. In the case being in Maine, there is one isolated grove of oak trees that definitely came from the south, and it's just an isolated occurrence. So, yes, foodways and saving seeds and stuff was important, but back then we were hunters and gatherers, nuts, berries, and fruits. And we loved root lilies, what we call Jerusalem artichoke or sunchokes were very popular. A lot of these plants had really good medicinal properties, and it was part of our main diet. So as hunter-gatherers or paleo indigenous people, I think the corn, beans, and squash came later. It's important to save those because those are old world species that were not in Europe. So I agree, Liz is doing a great thing, but I want to push it back to the paleo point where we didn't have agriculture, because that's when we had to settle into villages, and that's when colonials would come here and say, oh, God gave us this beautiful field of corn that was growing. Out of providence of God, look what we were gifted with. Like there was nobody to put it there. And, you know, if you look at the colonial construct, they did that repeatedly. Like God in his providence gave us all this bounty. So with that being said,
we have like 15 minutes left, and I still have 3 questions here. So I'm going to try to get through them before we run out of time.
Thank you. Kathleen Soldati. I have a question about the future. If you could imagine, and this is for any one of you, if you could imagine the future and where you want to go, and all of us came with you, all of us here today came with you, what does that future look like? Where are we going, and what can all of us be doing to help get there?
Well,
well,
that's not a loaded question. Well, I think ideally, well, give me a second here.
Here's what I like to say.
Chew on this.
What I'd like to see the state recognize their indigenous people here and stop saying they killed us all off. Mm-hmm. Develop a real solid indigenous perspective for New Hampshire and put it in the schools, and stop playing games about this thing that we're all dead and gone and that the colonial construct is the only one that we have to live up to. And I think if we start in the schools, I think education is the key thing. It fights, the next generation is going to be colorblind if they're allowed to be. So I think it's the education of our kids. And, you know, everybody says, why don't you take, you know, on Rochester about the Red Raiders? It's a lost cause unless your students want to change the name of that. And, you know, we've got to change our perspective of what the indigenous community looks like through education. And I think if we could all embrace the idea that how many times have you seen books, lies my teacher told me, you know, and it's true. We've got to stop this discussion that we're not here. And it's an uphill battle here in New Hampshire.
Yeah, I agree, Paul. Education is extremely important, and I do see that there's a culture shift, and that's amazing. But there's still a long way to go. And the first step in that is really teaching people that indigenous people still exist. And I would not be surprised if there were even somebody in this room who didn't realize that there were still Abenakis living in New Hampshire prior to today. And unfortunately, that's something that we struggle with all the time. One of the things I would love to see is that, you know, at a point, I am an educator. I've been an educator for a really long time. But one of the tough things about being Indian is when I tell someone that I am an indigenous person, they're like, whoa, what's that like? So, you know, I have to, yeah, how much are you? Can I touch your hair? So I find myself frequently in the position of having to explain how I exist and what my life is like rather than just being allowed to exist. And you know what? I'm a big girl. I pull my pants on one leg at a time, and, you know, and I can take that. But our youth, you know, our youth have to struggle with this too. You know, I'm going to embarrass my daughter again, but when she was in 6th grade, and she's now in 10th grade, so we come from a relatively small town, but she, you know, and in her small town, there was no question that she was Native. We would go in every year, we would do some programming with her classmates, and, you know, they were really great, you know, sort of making our youth colorblind. But then she got into middle school, and they had to do this culture project for her language arts program. And part of that culture program was researching your family and saying where you're from. Now, 6th grade, you were how old, 11, 12 at that time? So we have this preteen child being asked by her teacher to say where she's from. And she said, I'm from here. Okay? Which is true. She is from here. We are Abenaki. Our family is from Vermont and New Hampshire. We are from here. And the teacher, this woman with a college education, in charge of molding our children's minds, saying, no, you can't be from here. Where did you come from? So put this in perspective. As adults, we have the tools to handle that. We have the tools and the language and the ability to say, well, actually, you're wrong. But we have a 6th grade child who does not have those tools and does not have the social experience. And, you know, honestly, we teach our children to respect authority and respect the people that are teaching us, especially in Native culture. We have a profound respect for our elders and life experience. So we have this 11, 12-year-old child who is placed in an adversarial position with her teacher, telling her that she doesn't know what she really knows. So think about that for a second. We're asking our Indigenous youth to teach about themselves rather than experiencing their childhood. That's a really heavy burden. So I would love to see a place where our children didn't have to teach their elders, you know, where it could be the other way around, and that they didn't have to suffer from the same identity crises that my generation or my mother's generation had to go through. So,
A last question for today.
My name is Rich Grossman. I just want to know how much DNA or genetic testing, or if you did it or not, has informed your people and your migrations. And just a comment that both of you sound so. Both of you sound so Jewish. I'm Jewish.
you know, ironically, I'd like to give a shout out to my Jewish community over here who's adopted us. We fondly call them the Katu Jews, and they're the Kentucky Jews, and they've actually adopted us stray little Abenakis. So thank you. I will take that as a compliment. So to answer your question, I mentioned the eugenics program earlier, and just in brief. But again, just the eugenics program was a state-sponsored program that gave the legal right to medically experiment and sterilize Indians. So I know of a family story of where someone went in for a tonsillectomy and had one of her ovaries removed. I'm like, did you get lost on the route? Because, you know, they're really not in the same place. They failed their A&P class. But this is a reality in our communities. A lot of our communities, and probably Paul's family has this story too, moved from our homelands to Massachusetts to become French because it was safe. You know, my great-grandmother was of childbearing age and moved from Isle Lamont, Vermont, right up near Missisquoi and Swanton, down to central Massachusetts because it was safe. And my grandfather, God love him, he definitely still remembered that kind of stuff. He has since passed, but one of the things that he always said is if they don't know who you are, they can't hurt you. And my mom has definitely inherited this quality, and I have. And when I said that it was safer to be Indigenous now, it really is safer to be Indigenous. However, it's not all that safe still. You know, and if they don't know who we are, then they can't hurt us. So my family personally, we do not do the genetic testing, and we do not do it for several reasons. The first reason is if you do any of those Ancestry.com or 123me, whatever, you know, all those different genetic testings, you're signing away your right to your genetic material.
Right.
You no longer own that. So if you've done an Ancestry.com genetic test, they own your DNA. That doesn't mean they own your person, but they own all the genetic information that you've given them, and they can sell that to insurance companies. They can sell that to whoever they want. So they know who you are. But also, if you think of the science behind DNA testing, you only inherit half of your parents' genes. So even if there could be somebody who is 50% is going to show up as non-native because maybe they inherited their non-native parents' genes and not their native parents' genes. So you're not getting the whole picture with DNA testing.
Mm-hmm.
So, and another thing is there are 600 different types of Indians in the United States alone. So, and we're all very different, and I am extremely different genetically. And I'm pretty classically Abenaki. I look like a lot of Abenaki women I know. We have our big long faces and our black hair, and we all look very similar. Most of us look very similar. There's definitely a phenotype to Abenaki women, but I am very differently genetically than a Dene person or an Alaskan native or even a Mohawk who is right next to us. So how can they have a bank with all the different Native American genetics when there are so many and so diverse? And if you think, familial lines are huge. Like, how many great-great-great-grandparents do you have? You can have like 200. Well, maybe that's, I'm guesstimating, but you can have an exponentially large amount. So not only is the science perfect, but it's scary not knowing what my genetic material is being used for, or if it's going to prevent me from having health insurance because I have some sort of genetic predisposition for diabetes, which, I'm Indian, and I'm eating, American food, so probably.
I guess I wasn't asking you individually. I was just wondering whether we learned something from all the genetic testing.
No, and I agree with her. I mean, they really, this is kind of I almost want to use the word fraud, because the genetic testing that's going on now is trying to advertise, oh, we found Native American. It seems like a lot of the commercials show like it's Native American, or they're confused. I thought it was Scottish and I thought it was German and all that stuff. I did mine well before all of this was clever, I did mine way back, and it was part of a research project that was supposed to find out what the Acadian roots were, whether there was indigenous people, because historically, anybody had the name Roy was a royal, which meant they were probably an orphan from Paris that were, forced or given an option to resettle here in New France, as they said. So they were interested in finding out these divergent groups of people that were brought here originally as by the French to set up the colonies. So I did mine, and it went back. I was a Norman, what I'm saying? But then that made sense because I did follow all of these lines. I did a European trip last year following my roots on my colonial side. And it turned out, damn straight. I came from Norman blood, but that makes a lot of sense when you look at the migration out of Africa, and, we're all related within 50 generations or something like that. So the DNA thing right now where and even Facebook has these image things. You put your camera up and you take a picture, and it says how much percentage Native American you are. But every time you do it, it's a different percentage, Right. I think it's a mixed bag. I think if people really want to do any real research in their family, you do your genealogy. The DNA thing is just a fad right now. There is not enough database information. Yes, they have Kennewick Man, they have Aussie in the Alps, they have some old genetic markers. A lot of the tribes will not allow DNA testing of any human remains, dug up for repatriation. So there's a lot of issues about how you're going to really identify what the DNA strands look like for an Abenaki. And here we are, first contact. We already had European blood in us, in the 1600s, so it's really hard to sort it all out. Mitochondrial versus, the male side of the genome, it's a mess. And we've studied this. We've studied this in genealogy. We do see a pattern of remarrying every 7 years, almost like knowing genetics. We didn't remarry into the family lines in 7 generations. That's clanning, as they call it today. I think I look at these things, what was making up genetic material, it's very hard. Even genealogy doesn't tell you who was adopted sometimes and who was out of, like they say, born out of the marriage, so to speak. And those things happened every time there was a war sometime in history. Male-female relations broke down. And so looking at genetic markers is not a precise science. It's a precise science for that particular marker, but doesn't tell you where you came from.
Well, and it's also important to note that Native communities are made up more than genetics. You can't just have descendancy to be a Native person. You have to have a community connection. And there are a lot of people who join our communities who recently rediscover their roots. It happens, with all our families that we're trying to stay safe. However, it's not that you can discover your descendancy and all of a sudden be a member of the community. There's a lot of learning that's involved. I wholeheartedly believe that we are lifelong learners. I will learn until the day I die. And I was raised in my community. I know I've learned a lot in my community, and I will still continue to learn a lot in my community. But I've also earned my place in my community. It's not like you can just say, I'm Abenaki. I'm going to go to powwows. I'm going to go to ceremony. I'm going to automatically be accepted in my niche. And if you are on that journey, wonderful. It's great. Reclaim your heritage. But I encourage you to be a learner, be respectful, listen. Listen. That's the important part. Look and listen.
On that note, that's a perfect place to end our session. We thank you so much for being here.
I'd like to thank Siobhan for being here and dealing with us. Siobhan got caught between us.